Welcome to Voices of Australia, a podcast where we explore different perspectives on how to build a cohesive society. Today we're turning our attention to mental health, a topic that weaves itself into every corner of our society. As we unravel the intricate tapestry of mental well-being in Australia, we'll examine the prevalence of mental disorders, spotlight disparities in different communities, and discuss strategies to foster resilience and happiness. Consider this. A striking 44% of Australians have experienced a mental disorder, with mental health challenges spanning from anxiety to depression. These invisible battles are fought daily by millions. Alarmingly, the suicide rate amongst First Nations peoples is almost double that of non-indigenous individuals, a stark reminder of the urgent need for targeted support. Furthermore, the lack of data on mental health within migrant and refugee communities underscores the call for extensive research and culturally sensitive approaches. Our society's pulse is intrinsically linked to our collective mental well-being. It shapes our social interactions, strengthens our communities, and constructs the bridges of understanding and cooperation that foster social cohesion. This episode may contain themes that some may find disturbing. If it makes you feel uncomfortable, please reach out for support. Joining us today is Tigist Kebede, a senior counsellor at Polar Practice. A true force in the mental health sector, Tigist specialises in culturally responsive frameworks, delivering clinical therapy that resonates deeply with diverse settings. Her expertise extends to trauma-informed and intersectional approaches, creating a lifeline for marginalised communities. She is a driving force behind mental health advocacy, extending beyond the therapy room, reaching out to the wider community through health promotion and psychoeducation. With grassroots connections that have incited statewide challenges in culturally responsive health initiatives, Tigist brings to the table a nuanced perspective on mental health in Australia. Welcome, Tigist.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you joining us, especially on this particular topic. So I wondered, though, if maybe you could explain what you mean by culturally responsive frameworks and how do you incorporate those into your mental health practice?
Perfect. I think if it's okay, I might start with a bit of a story about how culturally responsive framework or practice came into Polar Practice. So in 2018, Polar Psychology was founded by Anthea Hancocks, a clinical psychologist, who wished to create a place where she wanted to see the world, but she couldn't find it. A place where highly competent practitioners in their disciplines didn't have to leave their own identity at the door. And the same thing going for, people who wanted to have well-being support. And she created Polar Psychology as just a generic psychology practice. I joined in 2019, and through our work together, we realized that, while culturally responsive practice incorporates an intersectional view that acknowledges, the socio-political factors that people's life exist in, because I think it's unrealistic to expect or to understand someone's well-being without understanding their intersectional experience and where they are at in terms of their context, where they're living, and how that can impact their well-being and mental health outcomes. So we started doing that together. And then through that work, we realized that culturally responsive practice isn't just an intervention or a thing that you do when you're doing intake or counseling. It's actually a way of engaging and doing the work in a way that responds to the system and the history, as well as the individual. So in 2021, together, Anthea and I created Polar Practice, which incorporated this worldview of individuals existing within societies who have had an impact in terms of their intersectional experiences. So someone who is an Indigenous person in this country, a Black Indigenous woman, might have a different experience to a white Anglo background man in this country, which will also be different to someone maybe who has a refugee background, or someone who's still an asylum seeker and who's kind of waiting to find out what their status is in this country. So by incorporating those things through polar practice, what we've done is we've taken culturally responsive practice and incorporated that as a way to engage the work that is both clinical in a sense, you're doing therapy, but incorporates communities, incorporates people around you, the communities that you serve, and listening to them and doing work with them. But then on the third layer, it's about creating systemic change to acknowledge the impact of marginalization and people's experience, and trying to create systemic change, whether that be in the mental health system, the health system in general, so that future experiences of communities and individuals change over time.
Thank you, Tigist. That's very thorough and great to start with a story. I think that's always really important. And it's nice to hear about the origin of polar psychology as well. I'm really curious, though. I'm curious about a couple of things, but one of them is perhaps you might be able to talk about some really distinct mental health challenges that you've observed within different cultural communities, because how these affect people's overall well-being.
Perfect. I think, given how broad that is, I love a good story. I come from an oral community who love, using examples. So what I often talk about is how someone's identity impacts the way they experience the world, which impacts how they feel the world, right? So if someone's experiencing, let's say, challenges in school because maybe they experience racism and they experience anger as a result of that. I'm angry that I get treated differently. I'm angry that another student gets a different outcome than I would for the same thing. And that translates in the workplace as well when they grow up. What ends up happening is that if we are not looking at someone's experience of racism as something that is impacting their well-being, we can then misunderstand that person's experience and be like, well, you just simply have anger issues. Or maybe in a more extreme version, well, you're just simply depressed because, of what's going on. When if I incorporate people's worldview and world experiences, I can understand now that someone's anger is an appropriate response to someone's experience of racism in a particular context. So if someone's experiencing symptoms that look like depression or anxiety, and I can incorporate that in a worldview, then I can be thinking, is this a completely normal response to an abnormal situation, or is this an abnormal response? And those are the differentiations that clinicians make. But in order to make that differentiation, I need to be understanding why you're having a particular response. And unless we're doing that culturally responsive frameworks and practices, and we're looking at people's intersectional experiences, there's a risk of misdiagnosing or misunderstanding someone's experiences, which I think then has a flow-on effect in terms of people's experiences in the world and what those outcomes might look like, and how, so for example, someone not understanding that someone could be really, really angry, they might be then diagnosed with something else instead of being like, okay, that is quite traumatic to experience racism. So let's understand how do we deal with the impacts of that trauma.
Tigist, you mentioned racism, and it is often used in a very broad sense. But then you talked about people being treated differently, and I'm wondering whether or not it's worth talking a little bit about the individual experiences that make up racism and the individual types of responses that people have to racism, rather than simply labeling a whole variety of different behaviours under that term racism. Would you be able to unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. So I think people can have a variation of responses to a racist incident or experience or experiences. So some of those responses, I try to incorporate a trauma-informed understanding of what that might be. So because the experience of racism can feel that you are at threat, whether that is a real threat in terms of your life is physically in danger, or it's a perceived threat of I might lose my job or my position or standing. I'm not sure what the outcome of that. People can often respond to these threats or through a survival response. So when we think of survival responses, we think of the 5 most common survival responses, which is the, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fake death. So let's use, that's the technical terms. Let's talk about what that might look like. So if someone in the classroom, let's say a young teenager, was called a racial slur, let's say they were called a racial slur. Some of those responses could be that they push back against the threat. How dare you say that to me? Rah, 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 yell back at the person. They could withdraw. They could walk away, not engage. They could freeze, stay silent. They could fawn, which is appeasing the threat, which often means that you have to put your own feelings at hold and think about the threat as something that you need to please or appease so they don't harm you. Or you can completely dissociate. So if I'm thinking of those from a trauma lens and from a trauma perspective, and I look at someone's behavior in a classroom, I can think of, what is happening to this person? And when we think of racism, we need to be thinking of, if it's a young African boy who's in year 10, how many times has this happened to them throughout their life? How many times has this happened to their parents throughout their lives?
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm thinking about these responses, I'm not just thinking about this singular moment, but I'm thinking of the cumulative experience that happens to someone. So maybe when they're 30 and they're engaging in therapy and they're like, when I experience racism, all I do is I just walk away. What are the impacts of walking away? What are the impacts of not being able to stand up for yourself or not being able to engage? And so that's how I look at that worldview. Instead of seeing someone as simply cold and detached, I think, okay, they might have had to walk away from things, or in another example, they might have learned over time that they have to stand up for themselves. So in my culture, that loud Black woman is very common, but then we experience the stereotype of the angry Black woman. So you see the impacts of these things and how that can happen over time. So hopefully that's answered your question.
It has, and it's been really terrific to hear you articulate it so clearly. These are very much around the individual's behaviour, but the individual themselves, as you point out, is not alone. Effectively, they're existing within a family context, regardless of what shape or size that looks like, and then also within a community context, and then, as you mentioned, this sort of more broader world view of things. So all of those things intersect to inform how an individual experiences mental well-being. Is that right?
Absolutely correct. And you can see how, if we start to understand people's individual responses as a response to things that are happening externally around them, we can see the patterns of behavior that moves from the individual all the way up to the system, both how communities experience things, but how other communities experience other communities. So I think that's a very specific example.
But it also highlights this, how important, how essential that culturally responsive framework is and finding a way to help others to effectively think differently, especially those that come from different cultures that might need some assistance in thinking through the experiences that they're having. And mental health and mental well-being isn't necessarily something that a lot of communities or individuals, for that matter, talk a lot about. So is it difficult for people to choose to identify that this is something that they would like some assistance with?
So I have a bit of a controversial take in this space. So my controversial take in this space is we often hear the word mental health. There's a stigma around mental health, and often marginalized communities, especially racially diverse communities, they have stigmas around speaking about mental health. And my pushback around this is that there is no stigma around well-being and what mental health means. All communities care about themselves as individuals, but also as a community. If you think of the refugee communities, as someone who is in a refugee background, there's nothing more caring than fleeing your country for a future generation to have better life outcomes than what is happening for you. So when I think of whether or not communities care about the well-being of individuals and others, they do, because they are often saying, hey, we need help around this area. I think what their stigma is around illness, around mental illness, and that stigma exists within all communities because it is something that people who experience mental illnesses or who are diagnosed have had a history of experiencing marginalization as a result of it, and have experienced being excluded, being treated differently, and having poorer well-being outcomes because of it. And I think when you add the layers of people's identities, there's worse and worse outcomes historically for people. So the stigma around illness, especially mental illness, we just think a few decades ago, people used to be in prison for mental illnesses. So I definitely think that's there. And that is something that all communities, in particular marginalized communities, can work on, and we are working on. But the conversation about well-being and taking care of ourselves, I think the most marginalized people are the ones who are the loudest around well-being and mental wellness, because they know how bad it can get to the point of when, you talk about people ending their lives because of things being so bad for them. And if we have such a prevalence of small pockets of communities having high statistics around ending their life or having poor mental health outcomes, then we can, other than saying, hey, there's something wrong with those specific individuals, which is inappropriate, we can actually start thinking what is happening around them that is causing people to choose not to be here than to be here.
Yeah.
So I think that's, hopefully that kind of resonates.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter who you talk to. Mental illness tends to, one, suggest something's wrong and potentially permanently wrong, but also it's in your mind or in your brain. So it's not something you can readily see. It's not like you broke your leg. It's something up there that's sort of quite difficult to put your finger on exactly what that is, and nobody knows how severe or not it is. So using that terminology doesn't necessarily help. I am intrigued by the fact that there is a lot of talk about we should be more open about talking about mental illness. But given that most people are a little bit uncertain as to how to deal with it, I'm wondering whether or not openness or open discussion is something that would be valuable. Should society be talking more about mental illness, or should we be talking more about resilience or our capacity to deal with the fluctuations of what happens from day to day?
I think, again, maybe another controversial take, I think especially when I'm talking to marginalized communities, especially when I'm talking to people who by nature of their marginalization are resilient as a default. If you exist and can thrive in systems where you are not counted in terms of your health outcomes, if you can experience marginalization, if you are advocating for legal rights, things that some people are privileged enough to get as a default, then you are resilient. That exists within you already because you are born that way. I often talk about my mum and being like, how can I teach my mum to be resilient when she walked from a country to come to here? So I'm thinking, okay, that can be quite offensive to some people to talk about resilience. I think, so that's how my stance, my controversial stance on resilience. But what we can talk about, I think, is the spectrum of conversation that exists around well-being, in particular mental well-being or mental health, because it is a spectrum conversation. There is a space to talk about illness because it exists and it should be destigmatized and people should receive support around it. And some of that support is through a practitioner, through medication, through communities. There are so many different ways that people receive support around mental illness that we should be able to psychoeducate and normalize those conversations. But we should also, and part of those conversations, I think this is the reason why conversation is important, is it means that it opens the door for other conversations around preventative things. If we start talking about the challenges that people have, then we can, it's not just focusing on the challenge, you're inadvertently talking about the things that you overcome, right? So yes, the XYZ is a challenge. So again, I use my mum as an example. Coming to Australia and not speaking the language was a challenge. And having being a single parent with a child and not knowing anything was awful. However, there are things that we can gain from that story, which is like how people overcome experiences of marginalizations until we can make historic change. What is it? Through community? Is it through advocacy? Is it through changing particular and finding these narratives around what works is how we create systemic change. And often people's well-being outcomes change not just from the specific intervention that you use, because a therapist is not a magician. They spend 15 minutes to maybe 2 hours, depending on who you're with, talking about particular interventions, and they might do, whether it's art-based or hypnotherapy, they do a particular intervention. But then you go off and live the rest of your life for a week or 2 weeks or a month. So there are other things that incorporate wellness that might include community, it might include your work, it might include your family. So when we are having these conversations, it's talking about the worldview. What are the things that we need to support? That is not just, hey, everyone needs to see a therapist.
Tigist, how do you go about describing where we would like people to be? How do you go about talking about the sort of position that people should feel comfortable in within their own world, rather than talking about resilience necessarily or happiness? What's the way of describing where we would like people to be their best selves?
That's a very broad question. I think when I'm talking to communities about understanding self and understanding where you're at, I think and a lot of people already have the answers to this, and some of it's just being really intentional. It's around, firstly, understanding who you are and your intersectional experiences. So who is Tigist, and what are her experiences as a cisgendered woman, as someone who has a refugee background, as someone who's had X, Y, Z things, and what are the challenges I face, and what are the strengths that I have that I can, so whether it's community resources, family resources, finances, and what are the barriers to some of the supports that I need, and how do I move forward? And sometimes a lot of the time, we can't out-therapy someone's experiences of homelessness, for example, because that's not an intervention. That is someone's real experiencing of lack of housing, or someone's experience of ongoing racism or family violence. So while we can do crisis intervention and support, I think really understanding self, and when I'm talking to my community about these things, I go, okay, where are you at? What's going on? And surprisingly, for a lot of people, they're like, actually, I'm doing pretty okay. These are the areas that I need support in. Some of them might be great with a therapist. Some of them, it's like, you know what, Tigist, I actually need someone to help me with employment, because, I experience a lot of barriers because I have a really ethnic sounding name. And what are the things that I can do to get support around that? And yes, I can provide therapeutic support about how disappointing that is and how challenging that is. But there is a real systemic issue that we're trying to address here that I, as a therapist, can't address. But I can acknowledge and support you through that process. So ideally, you want people to kind of be understanding where they're at, what are the things that are, they're having difficulties with, and where are the things that they need support.
Yeah, sort of understanding self and then deciding what is it I can actually control and do something about and feel comfortable about doing something in that space. Now, for you, one of the things that you feel very strongly about is this whole space in which you operate day in, day out, and the area of advocacy. How did you, how did you come to be interested in this space in the first place? But also, how do you now identify the best opportunities to do that advocacy?
So Nasalifi and I, my co-founder, we were having a real difficult time while it was still polar psychology, because this is during 2020, where we experienced the first wave of COVID, but also the hyper visibility of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and people are talking about these things in therapy going, these are difficulties I'm having. And Nasalifi and I were also having difficulties around this space, because we too are people who exist in a world where this is happening. And we realize that there are particular limitations that we have as therapists one-on-one. So part of the re-envisioning of our work as a practice and changing it to a practice and having that world view approach is that what are the benefits that I have as a therapist? And one of the benefits that I have is that people actually listen to me outside of the therapist space. So one of the things, the privileges that I have is that I can be an advocate for some of these things and create change as someone who has the access to things like government, but as well as other services and organizations. So I use the example of someone experiencing racism in their workplace. I can utilize my knowledges and work with the organizations to be anti-racist or to be more thoughtful about well-being and burnout, so that the individual, because it's not the individual's responsibility to not be racist, because they are not racist. They're the person who's being victimized in this space. So being able to be an advocate in that role means that we can go and create systemic change through a different pathway that doesn't hurt the people that we're seeing, but can eventually trickle down and kind of make that impact. Because if we can educate those people who are in control of the environments that our clients are working in, then maybe our clients' experiences won't actually be about, I had this racist experience in my workplace, let's deal with that. It might be something else. So that's the way we have decided to do that work. And we take the scientist practitioner model of doing research as well as doing the work and then education at the same time. So it's quite like a circle that's constantly happening. And we do the same thing within communities as well, because we heard things from our clients saying, my mum doesn't understand these things, or my siblings don't get it. My pastor, my imam doesn't understand. So we go out to communities and do introductory workshops or, trauma-informed workshops around those beginning preventative conversations around particular topics, because that's not everyone has to go to therapy, but people kind of people want to learn these things, and we as communities sometimes learn better in groups, and so we can hear it a lot better. So that's kind of how we've decided to utilize the privileges that we have to make a systemic difference.
Are you seeing any impact, Tigist, from the work that you're doing?
Definitely. I definitely hear it, because what I'm hearing from organizations, for example, is that they actually want to create more healthy workplaces that are inclusive and diverse, but they don't necessarily have the tools or strategies to be able to do that. And then that's where, because at the end of the day, people want to change. So being able to give people the tools for change means that people's experiences can be better down the track. It's just a long game. And I'm definitely seeing, over time, I think COVID has resulted in the amplification of well-being and mental health to be at the forefront of conversations, because something as extreme as COVID and the pandemic probably won't happen again for a long time. So it's pushed these conversations 10 years further than probably where it would have. So I'm definitely seeing the impact of organizations taking these conversations, communities. I've had aunties, uncles, parents, grandparents being like, we need to have a conversation about mental health and what's the difference between going to the hospital and, going to a therapist. Because, some communities think that if someone goes to a therapist, their child is going to be institutionalized, because maybe that's what happened in their country. Maybe that's their only experience of well-being intervention. So I'm seeing that through the demand and the uptake of well-being services in community spaces, individual spaces, and in organizations.
Yeah. Tigist, I think we should acknowledge the fact that you, both of you at Polar Psychology, are undertaking some research in order to provide tools for any psychologist or counsellor to be able to have a culturally responsive way of talking to any client that might come in their door. So I think that's it's really a very clear example of the great work that you're doing, and that importance of the research that you're bringing to play in informing how others can actually follow your record, your guidance in ensuring that, given that we live in a diverse society, that we can actually provide these services regardless of whose door somebody might knock on. I'm interested, just as a final piece, I guess, is to really ask you about how do you think this approach, this way of being able to better service and understand our communities through a mental wellbeing framework contributes to social cohesion?
I think the way it contributes to social cohesion is that some of the issues that arise for people that ensure that social cohesion doesn't happen can be addressed preventatively through culturally responsive practice, by understanding people's lived experience and what's going on for them in the context of where they're at. It means that you're responding to some of the factors that people are having this response to. So if you're noticing that there's a huge disengagement in education with young people from a particular background, then you can then prioritize that and be like, okay, what is happening? What is the experience of that young person that results in disengagement in school? So we can take 10, 15 steps back and start responding to it. And I think as a result, by acknowledging and validating people's experiences, it means that we can truly understand what are the barriers for social cohesion. Because it might not be education. It might, and most often is similar to that iceberg, right? Where all you can see is what's above the water and not what's below. And what we're trying to do through social cohesion, but most importantly, I think for us, through culturally responsive practices, is to see what the roots and what's underneath the water that's resulting in this one presentation that we see. Because if you just simply respond to the symptom, we're not actually looking at the cause of this. And I think when it has been done effectively, then you will see a more cohesive society, because a cohesive society is a society that understands people's diverse experiences and understands what can impact them and works towards a society that ensures that marginalization doesn't happen, but also ensures that people receive equitable practices, that people are able to engage and not be in that survival mode all the time. So I think that's how it, social cohesion plays into that. That is the end outcome that we want.
Absolutely. That iceberg analogy is just an incredibly useful paradigm in so many different situations, but perfect in this one. So, Tigist, I'm just delighted to have spent this time talking to you, and thank you so much for sharing so much of your knowledge with us and with our audience. We're just incredibly grateful. So thank you so much. Hi, Faisal. How are you?
I'm very good, Anthea. Thanks for having me back.
Feel better after that conversation with Tigist about mental well-being?
Yes, and particularly around some of those controversial topics as she said. I liked that each time she prefaced it that way.
Yeah.
But the way she put it, I don't think they sound controversial at all. It was really common sense.
Yeah, I really like the fact that she puts a lot of emphasis on prevention.
Yeah.
Helping people to plan for and prepare for the future.
Yeah.
And build on their own strengths. So I think all of those things were really important.
And you alluded to it right at the end about the iceberg. I think it's a really good reminder for anyone that's, working with people from whatever backgrounds really in, community development to settlement service or whatever space you end up being in, that there are so many other things that inform how someone might respond to something. You're really only seeing a presentation of a person. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I thought it was really good the way she picked up on the term, or at least helped me to pick up on the term of resilience.
Yeah.
That we do use it a lot
Yeah.
to talk about where people should be thinking, being resilient, but it's got so many different connotations.
Yeah.
It's almost a, suck it up and just get on with things type of meaning to it these days. So,
do you think there's maybe, what do you see as that social cohesion lens on mental health? Do you think that, because she did talk about her view on what a cohesive society is when it comes to mental health. What did you think of that?
No, I agree with her in the way that she talked about it. I think there are things that people want to discuss in private, and then there's how do we as a society help people feel comfortable to seek out the help when they need it, but not necessarily make it a burdensome element for society overall. And I think that's a real challenge to get that right.
I think that is kind of the thing that I've been conscious of lately is we have so much more emphasis on mental health, and so much even in our studies, whenever we release a mapping social cohesion, people talking about mental health and discrimination and all these other parts. But something Tigist said really sticks out to me is not everything is done in therapy, and they're not magicians.
Absolutely.
So there's so many other societal preventative things that we need to look at more carefully before we go down just that therapy route.
Yeah. And helping people to be able to cope with the things they can't control or can't have an impact on, like homelessness, for instance.
Yeah.
She's absolutely right. These are, how do we bring these conversations into thinking about systems and the sorts of challenges or rocks, if you like, that people come up against and can't necessarily find a way around. It's a challenge.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to think about after that conversation. So that was great.
Terrific.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voices of Australia podcast, brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. This podcast is produced by me, Faisal Farah, and with audio, visual, recording and editing by John Bigelow from Interactive Media Solutions. Research for each episode is provided by Agalos Makrijojos and Matthew Skidmore. Original music is by Steve Klapsinos. Learn more about the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute and all its works by visiting the website www.scanloninstitute.org.au.